Hello, thank you all for joining. My name is Christo Sween. I am the operations manager here at the Celtic Junction Arts Center. And it's my pleasure now to introduce to you Steve Griffith, who is the chair of the Celtic Junction Arts Center's Education Committee. He will be, I don't want to say leading this discussion because it's a chat between two people. The other person that he'll be introducing to you is Ann Williams, who is a political historian and playwright. So, Steve, I invite you to join in, and I will step away and turn it over to you to share the Dublin Lockout of 1913, this discussion.
Thank you, Christo. I'm very, very happy to be here today, and I welcome all of the participants in this. As you mentioned, it's a conversation. It's a conversation between myself and Dr. Ann Matthews and the hopefully other participants on this webinar. We ask that you put your questions, use the Q&A function for your questions today. And I think it'll be a very interesting hour. I have the extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Matthews. Dr. Matthews is a mature student, entered St. Patrick's College Maynooth in the early 1990s. She completed her master's thesis in 1995, focused on Cumann. And in 2003, she completed her doctoral thesis at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. It focused on women's activists in Irish Republican politics, 1900 to 1941. She received her PhD in 2004. So I would like to ask Ann to join us today, and we'll get started. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you.
So I thought we would begin a little bit today, Ann, why don't you give us a little bit of your backstory, how you got interested in, how you became a historian, and then tell us about your interest in the Dublin Lockout. As people know, the Dublin Lockout happened in 1913. It was a significant event in the history of Ireland, and certainly in the history of Ireland, labor relations in Ireland. And that will be our focus for today. But how did you get interested in the subject, and what tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay. In my generation, we all left school early because second level education wasn't available free until 1967. But I have always been a reader. I joined the library when I was 6, and I've been reading all my life. And my family were working class, but my stories is what I loved. To me, history is a story. And my mother, who had me when she was 40, and she experienced the lockout in 1916 and the Civil War as a child. And she talked about it quite a bit because it was traumatic, and her father died. So I grew up on her stories, and I didn't realize until I went to college as a mature student that I saw history as a story. And that's where I came from. So when I went to college as a mature student, I kind of fell into history because I just did. And I took it from there, and I just kept going. My history in the coming from a working class background, when I started college and I looked at Irish history as it was taught and as it was published, it bore no relevance to my life and my world and my experience of being an Irish girl growing up in Ireland. And especially as a woman, there was a girl or a woman, there was no reference to it, none at all. And so when I started to study, and I'm looking at it and realizing that what was out there wasn't relevant to my life, I started to explore. And I explored what women were doing at the time. And that's how I came into Cumann and the lockout. But the lockout was my mother's story. And that was how I came to write the play Lockout. And it's from there it started.
Maybe we should just step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the lockout itself. As I mentioned, it started in 1913 in Dublin. It was essentially started, as I understand it, with a strike by tram workers and then it quickly changed to a lockout rather than a strike. Could you help us understand that? And maybe a little bit about the background of labor in Dublin at the time?
Well, labour in Dublin, unskilled labour. It was about unskilled labour. The lockout, the background, unskilled labour was very, very badly paid. There were more labourers than there were work. And this came about from after the famine, post-famine, people from rural Ireland landed in Dublin. So there was an oversupply of labour, and the labour was cheap. They were paid very, very, very little. And in the centre of the city, where the grand mansions had been, when people flooded into the city, they were like, if you like, refugees from rural Ireland. They flooded into the city, and the people who owned the buildings rented out rooms at a time, and they called them lodging houses at the time. They then became known as tenements. But the difference between a tenement was a building, a tenement room or a tenement building was where the landlord just rented the room, and it was an empty room. So the people in there didn't have to pay rates. Whereas a building that was not a tenement, and a lot of them were not tenements, the individual person who rented the room paid rates as well. And that's the difference between a house let in flats and a tenement. So you can have two Georgian buildings where one is a tenement and one is let in flats. And that is the difference. So when we're looking at Strumpet City, he laid bare the poverty and the agitation and the realization that they were being deprived. And that came with James Larkin, who was from Liverpool. And he started the ball rolling, if you like, and encouraged people to believe that they were worth more than they were being paid. And it started with the Docklands, and it started with the Carters, the bottom of the pile, the bottom of the social life, where the people were so badly paid, and by the time they were 40, they were old and bent and worn out, and there was a new generation constantly feeding this cheap labor. And James Larkin enabled people to realize, hold on a minute, it doesn't have to be like this. And that's the genesis, if you like, of the lockout. And then when they started to challenge the employers of the city, particularly a man called William Martin Murphy, who was the biggest employer in the city and owned so much of the business in the city, when they started to challenge the employers, that's when the trouble began.
As I understand it, one of the sort of the overarching issues for Dublin was that it really wasn't an industrial city. It was a city of commerce. It was a city of goods distribution. It was the governmental center of Ireland, but it didn't have the big industry of, let's say, Belfast. Is that right?
Yes. Well, Dublin was always the heart, the second city of the empire. It was so called, and it was part of the empire. And then we had the Act of Union, which totally demoted Dublin as the center, and that's when it started to go downhill after that. So it was irrelevant. But there was no history of industry anywhere in the Dublin area or in Ireland. Ireland was a peasant society, and the purpose of Ireland was to create the food for the empire. And Dublin was just an administrative place. There was no industry whatsoever. There were small industries, but nothing major. So basically, everything came into Ireland, especially after railways. Everything came into Ireland and was distributed from Dublin throughout the country. So that was it, and it was, but there was skilled labor. You had the plumbers, the bakers, the candlestick makers. You have all of those people, but they were in guilds, and they were not open to somebody who was unskilled. So it was passed from father to son to son to son. So people who were unskilled, who came in from rural Ireland, who were unskilled, they were hanging on to the edge of everything.
And their jobs would have been dock workers, unloading the ships, carting coal and other goods throughout town, those kinds of things. And so it certainly took skill, but it wasn't called skilled labor as such.
No, anybody could do it. And there's one part of Dublin, there's north side, south side, but south side is southeast and southwest. So we go southwest to a place called Cork Street. That was on the edge of the city, kind of, because it was a small city. And it was an area of tanneries. So you have people living in dreadful conditions surrounded by tanneries. So there was that kind of material was there. There were weavers. There were mills on the Pottle River on the south side coming into the Liffey, and there were cotton weavers, flour mills, and they were all of that, but they were supply rather than industry. So there's a huge population of mill workers in all various kinds of mills in the city as well, which nobody ever talks about. And so they're there as well. And the lockout affected people outside of the city, like Lucan, which was outside the city, which was a rural village, and on the north side of the city. So the lockout affected people on the outside as well. People who were supplying flour, supplying foods, supplying goods to the vegetable markets, all of that, they were all affected by it as well. So it wasn't just the city centre, just it's written about the city centre all the time, and it focuses on that because the poverty was so awful, and it was visual, and people could see it, and the newspapers reported on it, and the battle. And then Larkin was 6 foot. The average Dublin man, like the English man, was about 5'3", and women were slightly smaller. So when Larkin arrived, he was over 6 foot, and he was big. So he towered over them. And when he spoke, he clearly had charisma, and he could make himself heard.
Tell us a little bit about it. Big Jim Larkin is what people called him, as I understand
because he was 6 foot something, yeah.
Yeah, so because of his height. So tell us a little bit about his background. As I understand, he grew up in Liverpool, I think.
Yes, he grew up in Liverpool. He was involved in the Labour movement, and he came to Dublin, make a long story short, and he came to Dublin and through the union. And then he saw the situation in Dublin and decided something had to be done about it. And he started his union in a very small tenement style building near the Custom House. And he started that around 1911, 1912, and then became ambitious because there were so many thousands of workers who needed help. And then eventually he came to take on the building known as Liberty Hall, which was an old hotel. It was an old hotel building. And he came to take this building on, and he rented it. And that became the centre of Labour in Dublin. The Labour Party had nothing to do with this, but Labour in Dublin, the union, unskilled Labour.
And at the time,
yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, at the time of the lockout, 1913, approximately how many people were in that union at that time, by that time?
We're talking up to over 10,000 off the top of my head now, over 10,000. The numbers grew exponentially as the lockout came into being, because people saw there might be a future here. You know, if we can come in here and we will get more money, we join the union and we'll see what can happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I just want to insert here that we're certainly welcome to take questions during the discussion. So if you have questions on anything that's come up so far, or there's something specific you'd like Anne to address during our hour together, please put it in the question and answer, use the question and answer function. So tell us a little bit about the people who you mentioned. You used the word peasant. Is that okay to use the word peasant?
Yeah,
for
I'm using
Ireland?
the word peasant because I've just read a wonderful book called Remembering Peasants. Yeah, by a man called Patrick Joyce, and it has made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense to me from this period, which I've been studying for years. And I've always had this thing about people coming in from rural Ireland, and this book clarifies it for me.
And the pressure to move from rural Ireland to the city was what? Just not enough work.
There was no pressure. There was no food. It was after the famine. There was nothing. The consolidation of land holdings. Rural labourers had nothing, so they ended up in the city, and then in the city they could get food. You know, they would be fed. The famine and post-famine, they would be fed, so they would come into the city, and then they stayed, and then they rented rooms. And you get the area known as Temple Bar nowadays. Anyone who's read about Dublin, that area was awash with lodging houses just after the famine. You know, so and they called them lodging houses at that time. So you could rent, you could put 6 people, 6 men mostly, into a room and take rent off them. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And that was how the degradation of a lot of the buildings in the city began.
And the other part of that, the buildings and the tenements, was the original owners leaving. I mean, after the Act of Union, 1801.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of factors. Yeah, the administration, a lot of industries died. The glove makers, the candlestick makers, who were supplying the castle, they're gone. But when we come to the famine period, and we come to that, they're long gone. But in that time, areas outside the city area. If you look at a map of Dublin, there's a circle. Outside that circle was County Dublin, and mostly Catholic developers. They built towns, ran out of Rathmines, Rathgar, a series of towns outside the edge of the city, and they were all semi-independent. So these towns didn't pay any rates to the city. So the people in the city with businesses moved wholesale outside the city. So the city was now a hollow of empty buildings, and no rates were being paid because the people who were there had moved, and they didn't have to pay rates and Rathmines and wherever to the city. They resented that, so they were gone. It's what rich people do all the time. Yes.
So the lockout happens in September, I think, of 1913.
August. September,
August.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's right. August 26th. And then essentially the tram workers just stop the trams, get off the trams. And essentially at that point it's a strike. And then William Martin Murphy decides he will break the strike by essentially making it into a lockout, locking his workers out unless they
Yes. So across the city, literally lockout means they close the doors and they lock them out. And once he did that, other employers followed suit. So it wasn't a strike anymore. They just simply put them out. And but it had started on the quays. It had started on the docklands. And
then, as I understand it, some 400 other employers joined that. So it wasn't only the tram workers. It was essentially
wholesale. Yep, wholesale. Yep. Yeah. Once it's like a domino effect. He did it. It worked. So everybody else did it as well, and they were locked out. There was men, women, and children in terms of numbers affected by the devastation of the lockout, numbered 80,000. 80,000 individuals, men, women, and children, who suffered badly because of the lockout, and all that happened while the employers and the union people in Jim Larkin fought it out.
And it just gets worse and worse and worse as time goes by.
Yeah. I mean, children were eating out of dustbins. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier. You mentioned the James Plunkett novel Strumpet City.
Yeah.
And I think several of the people who have joined us today were part of a reading group that I facilitated on that book. We had 3 nights of discussion. It was a wonderful experience. And tell us a little bit about how Plunkett sort of uses the strike or the lockout as sort of the central. For those of you who haven't read the book, essentially it starts in 1907, it ends in 1914. It shows us Dublin through the eyes of maybe 10 individuals and families as they move through this awful time of the previous to the lockout and then through the lockout. So it's very interesting. Do you think we've got a question here from Carol, and she says, could you address how women are portrayed in Strumpet City? Would you say the characters were realistic for the time period?
Plunkett wrote the book through his own lens, not through the lens of his lens of understanding these people. And all of the women in, like O'Casey as well, Sean O'Casey, the playwright, the women in Strumpet City and the women in O'Casey are portrayed as passive because he didn't know about women's lives. And they're one-dimensional. He has created female characters who are one-dimensional. The respectable, the middle class, the other respectable, the older respectable, and of course Lily Maxwell, who's clearly not of the good kind. She is a prostitute, and he can't bring himself to use the word prostitute. So he himself is conservative, and he brings his conservative attitude to telling the story, and it's completely one-dimensional. And he doesn't talk about how women fed the children, how they survived, who did survive, who didn't survive. There's none of that. It's a male story. It's a totally male heroic story, and the women are passive observers, and they experience the worst of the worst. But he still doesn't explain what the worst of the worst was. They suffered really badly. They lost children who died.
Do you think it's an accurate portrayal of the time, of the period, of the lockout?
It's an accurate portrayal of the actual lockout itself. but it's not an actual portrayal of how people lived, how the women lived. Rasher's tyranny is totally identifiable. And the men are drawn and they are identifiable, but the women are not, because he didn't know about women. There's no understanding of women's lives, and they're either plaster saints, as we call it here, or very bold devils, you know. So it's and the men are there, like Fitz is the respectable guy, and he marries Mary, who's the respectable domestic servant. He talked about Miss Gilchrist without having any sense of Miss Gilchrist, who is clearly a good age. She's worked all her life in service. She ends up in a workhouse. So he has no idea, how did she end up in a workhouse if she worked all her life as a single lady? She had no savings. He had no idea that there were convents in the city who looked after elderly women like that. He had no knowledge of women's lives. And that's why they're passive, one-dimensional and passive.
We've got another question, and I hope this conversation generates questions. So please use the question and answer function to ask your questions. There's a question here. It says regarding unions, were members required to pay dues?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. You paid. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody had to pay dues. I can't remember what the dues were now, but you couldn't be a member of a union unless you paid your dues, because the Jews ran the union and paid Larkin's wages and the wages of anyone else on the executive. But yes, you couldn't join the club unless you paid a fee.
Now, it's my understanding.
It wasn't. I can't remember how much it was, but yeah, they paid. They paid. Of course they did.
And it's my understanding that at the start of the lockout, money was coming into Ireland from the London unions.
Yes.
To help with this, you know, it was called it strike pay, but yes, but that trailed off towards the end. Is that right?
Yeah, the TUC in London started to support the Irish, but they didn't send money. They sent food, and they didn't send money because they thought the money would get wasted, or would they pay the rent, or they drink it in the pub or whatever. So it came in the food chips. It came in the form of food. And they did support the strike pay, and they paid a certain amount of strike pay. But by January, February, when it was clearly obvious the whole thing was going to collapse, they pulled the money and they pulled the food. Everybody, yeah. And the only people still feeding children were the penny dinners run by Catholic, Protestant, and other churches were feeding the poor.
I know you've written about that, that the issue of how the Catholic Church and others did feed children and families during the strike. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, those penny dinners?
Well, you see, the convent schools, there were primary schools, which were parish schools, and then there were convent schools. And convent schools had kitchens, and children who went to convent schools were given a dinner every day. And when the lockout came, they just increased the amount of dinners. There was a penny dinners, which was just off Merrion Square, in the laneway off Merrion Square. It was non-denominational, and they supplied food as well. And they were known as penny dinners because you paid a penny and you were given a dinner, and that was it. And they were there before the lockout, and the number of people going to the penny dinners mushroomed incredibly, and they were feeding thousands of people. Thousands of women and children were being fed. And they, in Liberty Hall, they opened a food kitchen. Not the first one. The first one was a soup kitchen that only lasted 4 weeks. The second one was a food kitchen, but it was open to the women of the men who were on strike. It wasn't open to all and sundry. So there were different ways. There were different ways of feeding people, but it was still they still didn't have the money to pay the rent. So any little bits and pieces they had, the pawn shops made a fortune. Any little, as you see, Mary, she's pawning all her stuff. So it's people lost everything. They were down to the bare bones. Down to the bare. They lost their beds, they lost their furniture, they lost everything, and they just had 4 walls in a room. And they didn't have cookers, by the way. They cooked on the fireplace. There's a mistake in Strumpet City where he describes Mrs. Mulhall as having a gas cooker. And then 20 pages later, they're all cooking on fires. And clearly someone didn't notice that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just want to make that clear. So, you know, those tenement houses, formerly very nice townhouses, would have fireplaces for heat in the rooms, and then
Yeah.
those became the only source of the way to cook food in when they became tenements.
Yes, every room had a fireplace, and yeah, and then they heated the room and they cooked on the room. And when people bought they used coal in Dublin, they used coal, and during the lockout, coal became expensive, so that winter was miserable for people. But there was coal, and there's a thing called slack, and it's slack is the dust from coal, and people would buy slack. And they didn't let the fire go out. So at night time, they would bed down the fire. This slack, they mixed it with water, almost like a paste. And then they would cover the fire with it. And it would keep the fire lighting, and it would keep the fire damped down overnight. And then in the morning, the wife would poke it, and the flame would come up, and then she would boil the water for the breakfast or whatever.
You mentioned the soup kitchen in Liberty Hall, or the food distribution. We've got a question, and it's about the animosity between Sean O'Casey, the playwright, and Constance Markovitz. She appears in Plunkett's book briefly. There's one scene where she helps Larkin into the hotel in disguise. But there was that animosity. Talk a little bit about that. You've studied Markovitz and written on her. Certainly, you know the work of O'Casey.
Okay. Okay. So, Countess Markovitz. The story is always told about Markovitz feeding the poor in Liberty Hall. There was a soup kitchen. They had a huge cauldron. The young girl sat around and they peeled the potatoes, wherever, and there's a photograph of her stirring the huge pot. Now, that lasted all of 3 weeks because it was totally chaotic. And what happened was the workers, you couldn't get the bowl of soup unless you had the ticket to show that your male relatives in the union. And men would come every day to get the ticket. And this went on for 4 weeks, and it was totally chaotic. And after 4 weeks, Larkin was in prison, and Connolly took over, and he stopped it. And he ensured that people got their tickets through their shop stewards. And then it settled down, and Larkin's sister then started a proper system of feeding people that was kind, whereas the soup kitchen was awful. It was awful, and it was and the newspapers turned up to describe people scrabbling for food, and then it stopped. But what happened towards the end of those 4 weeks, you had the great and the good of Irish society coming to see the poverty-stricken people being fed the soup, and it's in the newspapers. It's almost like the famine when they were doing soup up in Priors Collins Barracks. They were making soup, and the poverty-stricken of the city went to get soup, and the middle classes paid a ticket to see them being fed their soup. That happened in Liberty Hall, except they didn't charge them, and they were all there to be seen. You know, so it Connolly stopped that.
Tell us a little bit about Constance Markovitz and her. You know, we have this image of her in the kitchen doling out soup to the poor. Do you think that ever happened?
No, I think she was there for the photographer to dole out a bowl of soup. No, she was an attention seeker. She was the ultimate attention seeker. And yeah, and I don't have a very high opinion of her, so we won't go there.
Maybe we will if we have time.
She was
later.
A dilettante. No, she was a dilettante. She was a dilettante. Yeah. You know, and she thought, okay, she said of her, she saw the name over the door. She saw the title of the name over the door. She stepped inside and firmly believed she belonged. And I think his observations of her are very, very, very shrewd and sharp. And he wasn't the only one. It's just that people talk about him because, well, let's all dump on O'Casey. You know, and it's a little bit, she turned up, she asked could she stand on the cart where Larkin was making the speech. She opened her mouth, they heard the accent, and they instantly tipped the forelock. And here we are 110 years later, still tipping the forelock. We haven't grown up. And you're not allowed to criticize her. I will be dumped down from a great height for this, but nonetheless, we're still tipping the forelock. Let's look at what real people were doing. There's a lady called Grace Nail who set up a food system. She set up nurseries. She set up a system for feeding the mothers who were breastfeeding their babies in Liberty Hall. Nobody talks about her, but because she wasn't Lady Grace Nail, you know.
We've got a question that'll take us in a little bit different direction. What Bob says, what were the conditions in Galway or Cork during the lockout in Dublin? Was it any better in, could the people of Dublin maybe gone to Galway or Cork to receive help?
No, I mean, no, the people who are poor in Dublin couldn't afford the tram fare for a mile down the road. They had absolutely nothing. It's very hard to explain. Nothing. And traveling to Galway wasn't an option. They couldn't afford a train fare. And it was just happening in Dublin. And not only that, there was a perception had grown that Dublin was just, here's the thing. Okay, do you know where Strumpet is?
No.
Strumpet City.
Yeah, go ahead and tell us.
Okay, Strumpet is prostitute. So it's prostitute city. And Dublin was seen as the prostitute of the empire by rural Ireland. So anybody in Dublin who was hungry, starving, or whatever, they were just troublemakers. And when 1916 happened, the cancellation and whatever, and when it happened, somebody in Cork wrote that they weren't going to get involved because they saw it was James Connolly and the Citizen Army people who were just trying to start a fight, and they stayed back from it. And it took them 2 or 3 days to realize, oh, hold on a minute, it's not just James Larkin, And so the petty snobbery and looking at people in Dublin and making statements, and then this idea of rural Dublin versus rural was copper fastened by De Valera, who believed we should all be living in happy peasant land, dancing at crossroads, living in frugal comfort, dying of the cold in the winter. We should all be happy with that. That is still there in the psyche. But anybody who was, the rural poor, it was the rural poor who ended up in Dublin. And you can hear it, not now, but when I was a child, you could hear it in the various Dublin accents. North of the city, south of the city. So south of the city, South City, they all flattened their vowels. That comes from Wicklow, where they call Wicklow, right? And on the north side, the Dublin accent rounds out the vowels. Now, that stopped because Dublin has changed so much. But when I was a kid, you could hear it. The Liberties, the South Keys, the Liberties, people flattened their vowels. And on the north side of the city, we rounded out our vowels. And it was easy. But then when Dublin, by the 30s to 40s, and they started to build social housing, urban social housing, it became more complex. The accent became more complex. Because a lot of people who were living in social housing were also people 1 or 2 generations from rural Ireland, and they brought those accents with them. So it was a melting pot of accents, and still is. The Dublin accent is a melting pot of accents.
I just want to clarify something you said earlier. You used the term tipping the forelock. Now, I imagine that's like tipping the cap to someone who's above you in social status.
You meet someone on the road who is a lord and lady, and you tip the forelock. Yeah. I knew a lovely man one time, long time ago. Very, 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 very intelligent man, and he was from Wales, and he talked about his father was a rector, and one of the things that really, really made him angry was when he was walking along the road with his father, and the lord of the mansion came along, his father would lift his hat and tip the forelock. And that made me realize people were angry about that in Wales. I don't know about Ireland, but they tipped the forelock, and we are mentally still tipping that forelock. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And she was not a bright lady at all. And she was almost blind. She had very, 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 very short, she was very short-sighted.
Let's go back and talk a little bit more about the role of the government during the lockout, and the role of the Catholic Church. What were their positions on the lockout itself?
Well, see, the government were just not involved, and the politicians were not involved. But when we use the expression Catholic Church, what are we saying? Because the Catholic Church is like a label, but within that there are convents, there are seminaries, there are friaries, there are congregations who are feeding people all the time. And they were doing this up to the 1960s. They were feeding people up to the 1960s. But when people talk about the church, the convents were separate from the diocesan. Okay, they were under the supervision, if you like, of the diocesan bishops, but nonetheless, they operated semi-independently, and they did the work they did. and the bishop didn't have a say on who could get a bowl of soup and who couldn't. People turned up and they needed food, they were fed. And that's what happened during the lockout. And it wasn't just, and the bishop did get involved, but he got involved like the umbrella franchise for all the various Catholic societies that were feeding people. But today we have two of the biggest food places where people who are homeless get fed. And they are in two friaries. We are still feeding them. And the diocese, the Dublin diocese, has restaurants in various places around the city called the Blue Cross. And that's where people who have no money go and get fed. So it's still happening, but you don't hear about it because Catholic Church is a bad word to some people. You know, so we up to in my childhood, let's put it this way, in my childhood up to 1960s, everything that happened in Ireland that was bad was the fault of the British. Everything was the fault of the British. And then we got to the 70s and 80s and we joined the EU and you couldn't find the British anymore. So then suddenly everything became the fault of that church. Okay, so now that the church is almost gone, in 30 years, who will be blamed? Will we have walked away from our victimhood? This victimhood thing is very, very worrying. Yeah, and the whole world is changing and the whole world is nothing but war and climate. And all people do is, oh, it's the church. What about the 150,000 men who made women pregnant and they have never been asked to, never been called to account? You know, and
we have a question here from Elizabeth. I've heard the term on the dole, which I thought was the Irish welfare system. Was there such a system? Was there any kind of governmental welfare system at the time?
No, on the dole was unemployment benefit. That's if somebody was unemployed, they got unemployment benefit and it was called on the dole. At that time, the workhouse system was in operation and they went to the workhouse and they looked for outdoor assistance. The idea of dole as we understand it didn't exist then. So, but on the dole is let me see, 20s, 30s, unemployment, labor exchange, let me see, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when Ireland was really dog poor. And you'd see queues of men outside the labour exchange. Whereas before that, it was you looked to your local union, the Dublin Union. You keep it with Dublin, the Dublin Union, and you went there and you asked for outdoor relief.
Could you just clarify that a little bit, because it's the term union, like the South Dublin Union was part of the Rising. What does that term mean, union?
Oh yeah, no, union workhouses. Okay, Ireland was divided in going back to Norman times. Ireland was divided into separate unions, or townland or unions, and when they founded the workhouse system, the poor laws of the 1830s, each place was a union and it had its workhouse, so it was the union workhouse. So the South Dublin Union workhouse and the North Dublin Union workhouse, and Cork had a workhouse. Everywhere there was a union, there was a workhouse under the poor laws. I'm trying to make this very simple because it's really complicated. Yeah.
Right. And it's confusing to at least some of us. I grew up in the east side of St. Paul, and we have a workhouse, but the workhouse here is often sort of a low-level prison system. So if you get into trouble, you'll be sent to the workhouse. As in Ireland, as I understand it, the workhouse was a place where you worked for your keep, for food, or lodging.
There's a workhouse here an old workhouse here in Southbridge, but we stay with the Dublin one, so we don't go after. I remember my daughter, when she was in primary school, she came home because the teacher was talking to her about the Southbridge workhouse, and the teacher said to her at the time, people who went to the workhouse, people didn't want to go to the workhouse because you were really, really poor if you went to the workhouse, and didn't want people to know they were that poor. And the workhouse was hard and awful because they didn't want people going to the workhouse and finding they had a better life in there than they had at home. That's the way the teacher explained it to her, right? I know she's listening. That's the way they explained it to her. But the South Dublin Union, we'll just take the South Dublin Union. Every union had a hospital, it had a fever ward, it had the men, women. If a family went to the union, they were split. There was the children's section, the women's section, and the men's section, and they were fit and they had to work. And then there was the elderly, the abandoned, the fever hospital, those with syphilis, those with diseases that were contagious. And then there was those wards, the fever wards. And it was a huge administrative system. And every union in the country had one. And it was organized through the British government. They had it in the UK as well. It wasn't unique to Ireland. The system comes from the UK to Ireland. And this is, I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. So it's being run in Ireland through the Custom House. And this is the system. And it was collapsed by the Republicans in 1921. They collapsed the system without going into that either, because that's really complicated. But they collapsed the system in 21. But the South Dublin Union had ill people and paupers, had 5,000 people and paupers when the rebels went into the South Dublin Union in 1916. That was a breach of the Geneva Convention, and nobody ever talks about that. It's really interesting stuff. You know, so because the poor didn't matter. The poor never mattered, ever.
So the term union, just to clarify, it's you used in two contexts. There's the trade unions or the labor unions, and then what you're talking about is a system of governmental organization across the country.
Yes,
you know, we probably organize things by county, similar sorts of relief efforts by county.
You see, a union, a union. Okay, the Celtic Union took in parts of County Dublin and parts of Maynooth, so it wouldn't take in a county, so it was a union.
Right.
Different thing altogether. Yeah.
Some people have said that the lockout was a trial run for the 1916 Easter Rising. Do you think so?
No, absolutely not. No. During that period, the Citizen Army was formed, but Citizen Army was formed to enable the workers protect themselves by attacks from the police. Police would come and attack them with the batons and beat them. And they formed using hurley sticks. They started marching in formation. And it started with, they started a band, and the guys had to get their equipment, and they were practicing with the band, and the police would attack the band. So they formed they trained these men with the hurleys to walk alongside the band and protect the band and the instruments from being destroyed, because these were poor people, right? And that's how it started. And then it went from there to James Larkin and James Connolly, which is not something people seem to realize. They were big temperance men. They absolutely abhorred alcohol. Wouldn't have it on the premises under any circumstances. And James Larkin then took on a place called Croydon House, which was on the outskirts of Dublin, and it was rural. And the idea behind that was that workers could go there and they would have concerts, they would play games, they would have field days, they would do lessons, they would do all kinds of stuff. And that's what he set up. Now that collapsed by 1916. But the thing is, his idea was, and the idea behind all that social life was to keep them out of the pub. And Connolly was the same. They absolutely abhorred alcohol. And people don't ever talk about that. I don't know why. It's kind of it's a missing link. They did not approve of alcohol. They didn't drink, either of them.
Tell us a little bit about their relationship. I understand that they were not necessarily good friends.
No, they weren't.
Connolly and Larkin.
No, they were not buddies. Not buddies. Like Larkin saw the transport union as his, if you get me. And then when he was in prison, Connolly, who was a union manager in Belfast, came to take over as manager in Dublin while Larkin was in prison. And then Larkin came back. So there's that thing with Connolly, and what he sets up under him, they had a proper feeding system for people in he did a lot of good at that time. And then Larkin is back. And then at the end of the lockout, Larkin threw a hissy fit, let's put it that way. And he went to America in August of that year, but not before he secured Liberty Hall for the union. When the lockout was over, and men were told to get back to work any way they could, and they didn't win anything. But they had some money left in the union and need to put a deposit on the building. And then they took out a loan from the Ulster Bank and they bought Liberty Hall. And Larkin, the last thing he did before he left Ireland was, there was 3 trustees, and he was one of the trustees. And the last thing he did before he left Ireland was to go along and sign as the trustee of the building. And he was still the trustee when he came back. We won't go there because it gets all complicated. But the thing is, that's what he did. So he secured the building. And Liberty Hall exists today because of him.
And he was,
regardless of how you see him. Yeah.
Larkin was in the United States for something like 9 years, right?
He was, yeah. But they didn't change, the trusteeship wasn't changed.
Mhm.
You know, it was signed for, and that was it. It was his baby. And then when he came back, he thought he could just step in because he was a trustee, and it didn't happen for him. We'll draw a veil over that. Yeah. So that was it. But the thing is, Larkin and Connolly, like all great figures, they're not particularly nice people. You know, they have a name, they have a purpose, they do it. And that was it. And that Liberty Hall was used as the starting point. What's interesting about the Liberty Hall thing, I think, is that in 1916, Liberty Hall was the arsenal for the volunteers and the citizen army, and they all congregated there, and that was where they started the revolution. But instead of commemorating the starting of it, they commemorate the ending of it in Moore Street. But if SIPTU had not, or the Transport Union had not destroyed the original building in early 1960s, they would have an iconic building beyond anything you could imagine. And they lost it, but they lost it themselves. So now we don't commemorate the start of it, we commemorate the end of it. Totally different thing altogether, you know.
Were the people involved, let's say the people of Strumpet City,
Yeah.
the poor, the working class, the casual labor, were they part of the 1916 Easter Rising?
No. The membership of the Citizen Army in the earlier years, and then Connolly took over. So the membership is different. It shifts and it changes. No. Many of them didn't know. Sean O'Casey's actually, the Plough and the Stars, is very good on that. Whereas the young lad in the uniform, he's very observant. He's an observer of everything that happens. He's really good. So no, yeah. Sorry, I lost the thread there.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here. We have a side note from Allison, and she comments that the Minnesota County is an administrative area, and that's different than the unions that we were talking about. So that's Anne's daughter, she says.
Yeah, she is. She's my daughter. Thank you, Ellie. Thanks for that, because my brain wouldn't go there. It's called getting old, Al. It's called getting old. My brain wouldn't go to where I wanted. Yeah.
Certainly open for more questions as we come to the last few minutes of our time together. Did the Dublin Lockout have an impact after the Rising, labor relations in Ireland? Are they still impacted by the lockout?
No, the lockout was commemorated in 2013. They got a pat on the head from everybody, and then we got to 2016, and the lockout was forgotten about. The lockout is seen as something small, unimportant. These people were unimportant then, and they're unimportant now. They don't get talked about because they were at the bottom. They were below the lowest rung on the ladder. And they after 1916, into the War of Independence, they were sucked into the volunteers and into that system. And I believe, this is my reading of the evidence, when Connolly, we're told that Connolly was constantly writing about revolution. There was going to be, we were going to be a socialist republic, all of that stuff, and he was writing about it, and the volunteers were doing wherever they were doing on the south side. And then they kidnapped Connolly, and they brought him away for a few days. And the story is that they spent a few days with him, and they talked, and then they talked Connolly into coming on board. Rereading that over the years, from when I published all my stuff first, rereading that over the years, without Connolly, they would not have had a starting point for the rebellion, because the volunteers didn't have a building. They had a headquarters in Pearse Street, and they had volunteer councils all over the country, but they didn't have a center, whereas the Citizen Army had this center, this building, and the basement was full of guns, ammunition, wherever. And a few shops down the way, there was a printer, and they brought Connolly on board. They used him for that reason, and he had no problem with that either. I don't know if he knew he was being used, but they used Liberty Hall for that reason. And the fact that it was thought for a few days, it was thought that Liberty Hall was the headquarters and the centre of that rebellion, is in the fact that on the Wednesday, when the British Army with an 18-pounder blew the bejesus out of Liberty Hall, and they did it because they thought it was the headquarters of the revolution, and it wasn't. They simply used Liberty Hall as the starting point. And that's why when they destroyed that building, they destroyed their own history. That's what I think. I'm open to discussion.
Good, thank you. We have a question from Anne saying, how did the lockout end?
Miserably. They were told the money's gone. You're not getting any more. You won't be getting any. And this is what happened. The money's gone. There's no more money coming from England. We've run out of money, and you just have to get your job back wherever way you can. And like you say, at the end of Strumpet City, Fitz went and joined the British Army. So many men couldn't get their jobs back. They joined the British Army, and then of course those who survived World War I came back, and then they were dumped on all over the place because they fought in the British Army. They were in a no-win situation, whatever way it was looked at. And then their wives, when they were away, the wives got a separation allowance, and their wives were abused in post offices after 1916 because they were collecting the separation allowance. So it was a no-win situation for the people at the very, very bottom of society in Dublin at that time. And I think that it didn't change for a long time, and there's still an element of that there, because you'll still get people saying, "Oh, you know, they joined the British Army because, you know," but it was economic, and it meant that his wife, say Fitz, for example, he would have been earning 18 shillings a week, and he had a wife and 2 children. Okay, so he came over with 18 shillings, and they paid the rent. They were all fed. He had the odd pint now and again. She was getting charity support from charities and the Mrs. Bradshaw and all that stuff. And that was that. And then that was it. It was all over. And then he joined the British Army. And with the separation allowance and the money for her 2 children, she was getting £1 a week. And she didn't have to feed them and give them money for the pub. Right. So in that sense, there was a lot of jealousy of the women who had the few bob, because their women joined the army. And that women, infighting with women can be so vicious. But what always amazes me is, and nobody in my family was in the British Army, so I'm just saying that out loud, what amazed me about it was subsequently female historians dump on these women as well. And nobody has ever written the true story of how these women coped, because it's not allowed. You're not allowed to speak about that at all, because, well, you know, they joined the British Army and she suffered, and then he died and she got a pension, and who do you think she is anyway, you know? And so there's all of that. I was there talking in Galway about separation allowances about 4 years ago, and it was great. it was vibrant, and it was great. And there were people there whose grannies had the separation allowance, and they absolutely let historians have their opinions on how they were treating their grannies, you know. So there's a lot of what's going on is it hasn't been left behind because there's so much emotion invested in this, but it's all one-sided emotion. It's all, we are the great victims, you know. And yeah, victimhood is very wearing. Victimhood is boring as well, because it means that if you constantly be a victim, you don't look out. And we were no different to the rest of Europe. We were peasants like the rest of Europe. And the literature of the USA, the UK, Britain, and Western Europe talks about the young girls who were sent away because they were pregnant and not married. They talk about how peasants were treated so badly. It's all there. We were part of a European movement. You know, and here we are now again, and we're part of a European movement, but we still like to do the victim thing.
I have a question. Do Irish citizens still read James Plunkett's books, short stories, and essays?
I don't think so. I've not. When you contacted me, I can't think of, off the top of my hand, I know my daughter has read them, and I know you've read them, and I know your students have read them. I don't know anyone else has read them. But when it came out, first people read it, but then they made a television program about it, but they set it on the wrong side of the city. So people now think that Strumpet City happened in a part of the city where it didn't happen. you know, and we have a tenement museum, which I must go and see just to see what they do to that, you know, but the poor in Dublin were treated shabbily like the poor in Liverpool, London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Paris. I mean, anybody who has a titter of wit would read Zola and see what was going on. But people don't read. They like to stay in their little, we are victims here of everybody, you know. Sorry.
No, thank you very
I
much.
think I might be in danger of ranting here.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any closing thoughts or closing questions? We just got a question here. It says, what would you recommend that we read on this period? And you mentioned O'Casey. What titles?
Okay, well, there's his drama, The Plough and the Stars. Juno and the Paycock is set in the Civil War. But there's it's wonderful. I'll send you the title of it in a minute. It won't come to me at the moment. But there's the one where he wrote, and the Abbey refused to stage it, and then he took a huff and he left for England. And it'll come to me in a minute what the title of it is.
Yeah,
all of his plays come from his experience.
Yeah, Silver Tassie was one that was rejected.
That's the one, Silver Tassie. That is a fantastic play. That is absolutely, and it's from the reason, I think the reason Yeats turned it down was it's about a young man who joins the British Army. He's back in a hospital. He's lost his legs. I know you know the story, but I think Yeats and Lady Gregory turned it down because, well, it was British Army and they were now getting money from the new state. And I think that's why they turned it down. And I think that's why he left. I really do think that. But but he's just an observer, and he's slightly on the outside of everything. So he outsiders always observe, because what else do you do but look at what's happening, because you can't understand it. And that's what you do. But his stuff is brilliant. Now, he has written autobiographies, and they're a hard read because he writes in a form of Elizabethan English. He learned to read by Sunday school, reading the Bible, Elizabethan language. So his biographies are difficult to read for that reason. But they're worth it if you want to make the efforts. They're worth reading. But he's opinionated as well. But my thing about Sean O'Casey was he was a very, very narky man. But just because he was always annoyed doesn't mean he wasn't right some of the time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, I mean, you look at people and you listen, you don't dismiss everything they have to say.
I have one more question. Well, one more request actually, and that is for the people who are on the Zoom or the webinar today, who finished Plunkett's Strumpet City. We were wondering about Plunkett's second novel, and if he brought back any of the characters from Strumpet City to the second novel. And you told me what happens to Fitz, and I didn't know that. I have to admit, I hadn't read that novel. Yeah. So
Plunkett was a one-book man, if you know what I mean. And when he wrote that, I bought the second book and I read it. And it's a different generation. It's the next generation. But in it, he tells us what happens to Fitz, and Fitz was blinded, and he came back blind, and he's living with Mary and the children somewhere. And that was it. And then the rest of it is about his father, the character's father, who learned to drive in World War I, and he's chauffeur for some rich man. And he gets very wet one day because the rich man left him out in the rain, and he died. But it's my memory of it now, because I didn't reread it because we were doing this, but my memory of it was that it was very Catholic conservative book. He was going to be a priest and all of that stuff, and he goes on hiking trips up the mountains, and he's discussing whatever. But James Plunkett, I can't remember his real name, but he was so conservative in every which way. He was so conservative, and people totally miss the word strumpet. They totally miss it.
Do you think he had problems with getting his Strumpet City published? It took a long time to write it, but.
Well, no, it would have taken a long, long time. And I mean, you're talking the days when everything was handwritten and the cutting and pasting and whatever. Yeah, that would have been a nightmare. And no, it's an amazing book, absolutely amazing book. And he had that book in him, and he knew his city really well. But the city he's describing, the South City he's describing, existed in his youth. But by the time we came to the 40s and 50s, anybody born after that has no memory of it because they demolished that whole area and they built social housing, what you would call the projects in the States. They built massive social housing on that site. So you can't go and do a walking tour of it and say that was here and that was there and that was there. And he describes like the house, like the court where the house is it's amalgam of different houses. You know, it's not just one, it's several houses, and it's an amalgam of them.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have you back and we'll do this again for some time. And maybe in Minnesota, you can teach a class at Celtic Junction for us, or at least do a little presentation. I just also want to recommend both of your books. I really appreciate both of the Renegades, Dissidents. Very interesting take on that time period and the role of women. So
if anybody wants to get a better handle on the lockout, my book, The Irish Citizen Army, will give it to them.
This one?
No, it's The Irish Citizen Army. I have a book called The Irish Citizen Army.
Oh, okay.
I'll send you a photograph of it.
Yeah.
The Irish Citizen Army, and it will give you an absolutely nitty-gritty description of the lockout, what happened, the lockout, 1916, the whole lot. I'd have to look for it. So if
that would be great. That would be great. I'll get it from the library at Celtic Junction.
Yeah.
So
due to my insistence on writing the story about women and men, because they all lived in the same society, they will find lots of stuff about women in the Irish Citizen Army and what they actually did and didn't do. Yeah.
Good. Well, I look forward to reading that. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Okay, I'm now sitting here thinking, oh my God, when he sends me that YouTube, oh my God, yes. Okay,
it'll be grand. It'll be grand. Thank you, Anne, so much for sharing your passion and knowledge with us today. We're looking forward to reading more that you've recommended and that you've written. I think that what I'll do in our conversation after the webinar closes out here is we'll put a list together for folks and include it in the comments in the YouTube video, so that there's a reading list that we can share with folks to do, including your generous offer of your book too. So, and so,
sorry, go on.
Yeah. And Steve, thank you very much for driving the conversation here and leading us through this very fascinating time in Irish history and in Dublin's history. It's just fascinating. Been a great conversation. So thanks to you both, and thanks to everyone who joined. We're closing out the webinar now. So unless you have one more thing to say, Anne, it looked like you were teeing up.
No, what I'll do is I'll make a list of books that I recommend.
Yeah.
History, not written by me now, written by people. I'll make a list of plays. There are some great plays, and I'll make a list and I'll send them to Stephen. I'll do it in the next few days. Yeah.
It'll be great. We'll include that in the when we rebroadcast this on YouTube and share it with folks. So thank you again very much.
Okay. Bye.